So my name is Sebastian Straub. I'm the Principal Solutions Architect at N2WS. Welcome to the webinar, Immutable Backups Explained. And I have somebody really interesting with me today. It's Mike Strassman. Mike, want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Sebastian. My name is Mike Strassman. I'm a partner solutions architect with AWS. So I work with ISV partners like N2WS to help them build, market, and sell solutions that integrate with or run on AWS. I'm really super happy to be here today. It's an exciting topic.
All right, well, so let's dive right in because we got a lot of stuff to cover. So the first slide I'm going to bring up is the current state of ransomware. I love PowerPoint slides with numbers, and these are just some hand-picked numbers from the ransomware pot. And it gets even more interesting when you look at the big picture. So 2021, almost $1 billion was paid in ransomware demands. And that number went down to about half of that in 2022. But that's not because it's not happening anymore. It's just because a lot of companies aren't reporting on the numbers anymore. Now, Mike, would you agree on that?
Yeah, I think so. Like you said, numbers are awesome to see. I recently saw a Gartner prediction that 75% of IT organizations are going to face one or more ransomware events by 2025. So if we assume that that statement is correct, that means 3 out of 4 people on this webinar should be expecting an attack in the next couple of years. And we need to be prepared. And I was kind of digging through some AWS presentations when I was preparing for this, and I saw one that had the famous Benjamin Franklin quote that's, by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. And I think that's key here. I mean, we know it's coming. We know it's going to happen. We all have to be prepared to make sure we can protect our data and protect our business when the inevitable happens.
Wow, that's very true. Yeah, I totally agree on that. And well, as we discussed, ransomware attacks happen all the time. And sometimes large corporations downplay them, but it is what it is. So, for example, just some examples here. Minneapolis School District, that just happened. And officially, they call it an encryption event. That's like calling a 43 car pileup on the freeway a minor fender bender. They were asked to pay $1 million, which they didn't do. And this minor encryption event actually shut down many schools in the school district for an entire week. I guess you call that a forced snow day or a snow week. Rackspace, that's an interesting one as well. That happened in 2022, and their hosted email servers were attacked. 27 of their customers couldn't get into their emails, none at all. Email just shut down, corporate email. And from all reports that I found on this, they just gave up altogether and rebuilt their entire email servers inside Microsoft 365. I guess to pay or not to pay, that is the question. So another thing that I found is, and according to a study by IDC, 43% of businesses that lose their data for more than 3 days ultimately go out of business. One example that I always bring up is CodeSpaces. That's a company that was in AWS, did all the right things, performed backups, cross-region backups, but was still compromised. And when they didn't pay, they lost it all and went out of business within 24 hours. And the other problem is, and it's on this slide, if Hollywood movies have taught me anything, it's that once you pay a blackmailer, what's to keep them from coming back, right?
Well, and then Sebastian, the other thing I saw is the most common scenario after a ransom attack and after demanding a ransom, this bad actor, staying with the Hollywood theme, they don't return the data anyway. Either they don't have it, they can't unencrypt it, they never intended to return it, but they got what they wanted, and they certainly have already proven, because they're a bad actor, they don't care about you or your company or your data. Paying the ransom, whether you pay it or not, is no guarantee that you're going to get your data back.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I guess there is no honor amongst thieves, right?
Yeah, exactly.
then here, the biggest cost isn't the ransom. And this is something that most people don't think about. So one of the scarier prospects nowadays is that they're increasingly targeting the healthcare industry. So in 2022, there were high visibility attacks on Texas Methodist McKinney Hospital. The other one was St. Charles Health System. And NBC News actually reported in a study that found that the increase in cyber attacks against healthcare facilities often leads to increased patient mortality rates. And some hacking groups, I guess, even found a moral compass, because after a leading cyber attack on a hospital, the Lockbit group apologized after launching a ransomware attack on the Sick Kids Children's Hospital. So it's pretty bad. It's not just the ransom itself. There's a lot of things that flow into that equation as well.
Yeah, I think, Sebastian, we've all seen these estimates about the, and your example about the Children's Hospital, Trump, overrides this, but we've all seen estimates about the cost per hour of downtime to your critical applications, and I've seen those numbers vary dramatically. But I've never seen one that's lower than six figures in all the estimates I've seen. So it can be very expensive, obviously, to, the loss of data is one thing, and paying the ransom and all those costs, but the cost to your business of not operating is huge.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Well, ransomware that's really a scary campfire horror tale, and there's no flashlight under your face needed for that. So infrastructure as a service, IaaS, or software as a service, SaaS, we've all heard of that before. But something that I looked into is, have you heard of RAS, ransomware as a service? So I'm not kidding. That actually exists on the dark web. Heck, you don't even have to go into the dark web. There's Twitter sites that provide it. It's literally business. You sign up, you choose what you would like your terrible software to do, what your preferred pay channels are, and then this RAS provides you with malicious code, and then it's just up to you to introduce that into a corporation's bloodstream. So no programming skills required at all. They do it all for you, even handle payment monitoring. It's as easy as opening a donut shop, probably easier because you don't even need a good recipe. And the market has gotten so competitive that there's different ransomware as a service providers now competing against each other for nefarious business. It's absolutely crazy. So how does ransomware work? Pretty simple, right? Part one, the infection. This can come through many, many, many different avenues. One funny story, and I swear it's a true story. I was working at a company a long time ago, and when first viruses and things like that came through email, and we had email virus killers installed that wouldn't let you execute any nefarious code. And it said the title of the email was, "I want to meet you." And well, I was actually called into the CEO's office, and he said, "I'm having trouble opening an email here. I really want to get into it." So everybody is at risk here. Part two, well, that's the execution. It triggers and possibly multiplies through your network and environment. And then part three, encryption. That's the scary part. Your data is suddenly locked and inaccessible. And I guess part three, the kidnappers, or would that be data nappers, send or show a demand. And generally, that's combined with a time limit. So that's why we have that little bomb there. Do this now, or we'll delete your data forever in X amount of hours, just to force a knee-jerk decision. And then lastly, well, part five, payment. Vast amount of time. This is via cryptocurrency, so it's untraceable, obviously. And there's no bad guy waiting outside and you hand them a briefcase. Those days are over. And if you're very, very, very lucky, you get a decryption key. And sometimes, as you already said, Mike, you don't. You'd never see that data again. That's just gone. At this point, we're probably all thinking about, how do I ransomware-proof my life, data, and resources? So when I'm thinking about keeping something safe, my thoughts immediately go to a castle. I know You probably didn't think you'd see a castle today in a webinar involving Amazon Web Services. So let's talk about the analogy. So email filtering, just mentioned that. Web blocking, that's got to be your mode. No need to think about this. They just can't swim across. Ideally, throw some alligators in there too. And the arrow slits or mullioned windows, and yes, I did look up those words, that would be your software updates and employee training. You want these things coming, and you want your employees to be trained lookouts. And well, at the top we have the ramparts. That would be your anti-malware and anti-phishing software. So this is where you put or pour hot oil on the invaders. But the most important thing, the very last line of defense, that's what you really need to defend and protect. And that's your effective backup and disaster recovery capability. That's where you really want to draw the line in the sand. Your backups, that's the last line of defense. If everything else fails, this is what's going to help you.
Yeah, and I think, Sebastian, before you move on from this, I really like the castle analogy. And as one of the slides, or we pointed out earlier, the only guaranteed method of getting your data back is having a usable backup that you can recover from. And we've all, I think, seen the NIST framework with 5 functions, and I think those apply to what we see on this slide from the castle analogy. But the protect and recover functions are really good places to start, because like we said, that's the guaranteed method of getting your data back, and that's what we're focusing on here. But I do really like the castle. I think I could swim that moat, though, I think.
Well, we should try.
Yeah.
So as you said, so what's better than a backup? Well, an immutable backup. And this isn't a new concept or anything. So immutability really means unchanging over time. And you want to reduce human error by automating. The less people do and the more you automate, heck, that's the better. So if we go through these items, protect against bugs, that's great. Protect against malicious attacks, well, that's what we've been talking about. Then capture a golden copy or a golden master. Satisfy compliance requirements, right? I mean, you name it, healthcare, financial industry, there are compliance requirements where you must keep the data for X amount of time. Protect against accidental deletion. God, that happens a lot. I mean, in another lifetime, I was a backup admin, and that's something I had to deal with almost on a daily basis. And well, talking from that same experience, that very last one here on the right, protect against human error. You know what's the scariest sound in information technology? The scariest sound is, oops, I made a mistake. That happens quite a bit as well.
Yeah, and it's funny, Sebastian, because you talked about automation at the beginning, but I would add another bullet of like rogue automation. I've actually lived through cases of automation taking off and deleting the wrong things and doing it very efficiently.
Good point.
And, yeah, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong.
For sure. Oh, yeah. Well, computers are there just to throw us off a little bit, to create new problems that we didn't have without computers.
Yep.
So then when we're talking about immutable backups, well, then we should probably talk about the WER model. So WER model is also known as write once, read many. Now, if you apply that to an everyday example, an everyday situation, let's say you have a family recipe book that allows the WER model. Once you write it down, the secret recipe for grandma's famous chocolate chip cookies, it becomes fair game for everyone in the family to read and replicate. But nobody gets to put coffee stains on it. Nobody gets to spill jam all over it. So suddenly your cookies are in high demand as everyone tries their hand at baking them. So whether you love cookies or not, the WER model brings a really unique twist to how information is stored and accessed.
Yeah, and I think it's funny you have the typewriter on there, because I'm not sure these days anybody even knows what that is. But
that's an extremely good point. I actually saw an article where they put a bunch of school kids. You know how the safe icon is a floppy disk? But they didn't even know what it is. They knew that it means safe, but they had no idea what a floppy disk is. So you're absolutely right. Soon we'll have to replace that as well. Write once, read many in immutability. That's where AWS thought, let's call that object lock. And gosh, I've been talking a lot. Mike, can you give us some more detailed background, some insider information on S3 and object lock?
Sure. Yep. Number one, S3 is Amazon or AWS's. Sorry, not enough coffee today. AWS's object store, multi-purpose, used by millions of customers for millions of use cases. And storing backup data is one very common use case. And with S3, we introduced this capability or this feature called object lock. And object lock has been assessed for use in environments that are subject to SEC, FINRA, and CFTC regulations. It has two modes, which is important for people to understand. It has governance mode and compliance mode, and the difference between those two modes are who can delete objects that have been locked with object lock. So in governance mode, you can designate certain users have the permission to delete objects that have been written with a lock applied. In compliance mode, nobody can. And that literally means nobody. So when you create a bucket, you enable object lock when you create the bucket. You can't do it. You can't turn it on or turn it off after the bucket's created. And that also turns on a feature we call versioning, which is associated with object lock, but don't really need to get into that. And when you enable object lock, that only allows locks to be created. It doesn't actually create any locks on objects. So that comes later, and we'll talk about that and how it applies to the N2WS solution. But you can set up a bucket level default retention period, and that's measured in days or years, so that all objects that are written into that bucket that has object lock enabled and has a default retention period set will inherit that default. And then that's unless the retention is explicitly specified some other way. But with N2WS, that doesn't matter. So when you're using a default retention, it actually sets a retain until date on the object, and that's stored with the object, and that's calculated when it's stored. So if you have a 30-day default retention when you write the object or when the object is written, S3 calculates the retain until date and puts that in the metadata of the object, and that object cannot be deleted until that date. And locks can only be extended; they can't be shortened or deleted. So that's my whatever that was 1 minute super fast overview of S3 and object lock. Did it all make sense?
Excellent. Absolutely. That was really good. I just kept thinking about that castle. And like you said, object lock, that is the gate. That is really the gate that's going to keep it all together. So as luck would have it, I can introduce you to a solution which will bring all of that and much more to you. And that's N2WS Backup and Recovery for AWS. And N2WS Backup and Recovery for AWS is truly the #1 rated backup solution in the AWS marketplace. It's extremely flexible. So when you create backup policies, you can create them anywhere between minutes and months. I do have some customers who perform backups every 5, 10, 15 minutes. And you can also schedule them very flexibly. If you could say, well, let's perform backups every 5 minutes. And like, for example, in the financial sector, that's where you see this, where every transaction counts. But outside business hours, I don't need every 5 minutes. How about if we fall back on every 6 hours, every 8 hours? So it's extremely flexible. The other thing that is, it's distributed as an AMI pre-configured in the AWS marketplace. You can just simply pick it up from one moment to the next. And it's as close as possible to that AWS service, which means near zero RTO. You can literally recover within seconds across different regions, across different accounts. And it's super user-friendly. So it has dashboards, monitoring, alerting, reporting, and a bunch of different third-party integrations built in. Something else that we're also super proud of is these little badges that you see here at the bottom. So we are an AWS partner in public sector, government software competency, very proud of that one, storage competency, and so on. And what I usually tell people is AWS and N2WS are just better together. It's like puzzle pieces that fit together. So on the left side of the screen, this is where you see what AWS provides. The very robust Amazon EBS snapshots, super fast, very powerful APIs, CLIs, durable storage. I mean, we're talking super durable storage. S3, there's so many nines behind the comma. That's like behind the decimal point. That's just
we don't even fit on the slide. Yeah.
Exactly. Then AWS Lambda scripting, there's like nothing you can do with it. And of course, different regions and availability zones. So it really makes no difference where you are in the world. There's a data center that can hold your data there, even if there are some compliance requirements where you can say, that data can't leave a certain country. That can easily be achieved. And gosh, there are new Amazon services all the time. So probably since this webinar started, Amazon probably introduced 3 new services, but these are all of the ones that pretty much everybody knows about. EC2, EBS, EFS, they're super powerful. I mean, there's a lot of thinking that goes into the development of these services. And then on the right side of the screen, this is really where N2WS ties into that. So the disaster recovery, very intuitive UI. I usually tell people I can teach N2WS backup and recovery to people in about 15 minutes. It really is that easy. Recovery scenarios, we're going to get into that. That's orchestration, cost explorer integration. How much is this all going to cost me? And there is no sticker shock at the end of the month. VPC backup, network configuration, archiving of the data into S3 Glacier for data that I need to keep for a very long time. And then, of course, application consistent backups for my databases. So I'm not going to lose any of my transactions. And file level recovery, which means, well, we can get to certain files and folders even inside block storage snapshots.
Yeah, and Sebastian, I was just going to point out that archive to S3 and Glacier feature that you mentioned on the light blue. That I think that's key to this webinar and the topic that we're covering. And it's also, that's where customers have the opportunity to save money to, like you said, improve their durability of their backups, and then also take advantage of immutability. So that's a key feature to highlight amongst all those other really cool features as well.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you know how it is. When something goes wrong, you usually want to let's fall back on the last backup or backup 3 days ago. But nobody's going to cry if you tell them, hey, that backup you requested from last October, I can get that back from S3. And we're actually saving a bunch of money by storing it in S3. That's always a great option as well. Let's create a highly secure snapshot vault. So how does that work? Well, pretty simple, right? So you have an AWS account and you have your backups as a snapshot stored in that region. Now, you do have the option to perform cross-region backups. So that means I can actually make those backups available in a different region, in another data center across the world. And because we're just talking about old technology, I remember back in the day when at the end of the day, I would create backup tapes, and then I would hand these backup tapes to somebody who would come by from Iron Mountain and then take the tapes away. That's no longer the case. So it's literally just 3 mouse clicks, and you can transfer all of your backups to a completely different continent if you wanted to. And then, of course, you also have the ability to perform cross-account backups, not just from one region to another, but you can literally store the data in a completely different, separate, unrelated AWS account. And then ultimately, you even have the ability to put the data into S3 buckets. And as we jokingly mentioned several times, I mean, S3, that's insanely robust. Disaster recovery drills and testing. I think that's also something that's super important because, well, when you perform backups, the next question is, can you actually bring them back, and can we actually run a drill? So one thing that people most of the time don't think about, large corporations, how often do they perform a real, true disaster recovery drill? Like once, twice a year. Hardly anybody performs DR drills more often than not, because there's a lot of work involved, a lot of planning. So N2WS backup and recovery has that built in. It can literally automate the entire process of DR test drilling for you. And because of that, because it's completely automated, I could, if I wanted to, perform a DR drill once a week. And the system will not only perform that DR drill, but it can then also generate a report and send it to me at the end of that, and I can then submit that with my DR drill as well. And this entire process also gives you the ability to back up your network configuration as well. Back in the day, on-prem servers, if I would say, I'm going to bring back your on-prem server and I'm going to put it on your desk, but I'm not going to give you any routers, no switches, no cables, no connectivity, the answer would probably be, that's not going to do me much good. Well, it's not any different in the cloud. So having the ability to bring back VPC settings, subnet settings, routing tables, security groups, VPN connections, all of that is super important as well, because having the ability to bring back resources and make them available to my customers, my clients, my employees, really, really important as well.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of underscore what you said, clearly having usable data to recover from is step one. But just as important is ensuring you know how to recover it, and not just recover the data, but recover the applications, which includes, which application needs to be recovered first, what priority they have, how to bring up the whole application, and making sure you've tested that and you know how to do it, and you continue to do that over time is I think on the same level as making sure you have the data. So just want to underscore the importance of the points you made, Sebastian.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yep, you're absolutely right. All right, which brings us to the next slide. Bonus anti-ransomware capabilities with N2WS. So some of the bonuses that you have, something that people always mention is, okay, so if I have N2WS, but what happens if N2WS itself fails? Well, that's okay, because N2WS can restore itself very easily, because it's just simply deployed as an AMI through the AWS marketplace. And the entire metadata, all of the information about your backups, well, that's also stored as a backup as well. And something else that's important is you're in control of the attack surface, because it's your backup service. You're running it inside your AWS account. So N2WS Backup and Recovery runs in your environment. Only you have access to it, and you're not sharing this with any other customers. So you're in complete control. Indestructible backups. So backups aren't kept on any Windows, Linux machine, or a network share. So a lot of times when I do presentations, people usually say, well, yeah, but what happens if that server that holds my backups crashes? Not at all, because the data, the backup data, never leaves that cloud native format, because you can't really improve on snapshots. You really can't improve on this. So we're not going to turn this into some proprietary format that only we can read and it's stored on our network shares or anything like that. So the data never leaves your account, and it never leaves a cloud native format. And that brings us to, I jumped over number 3. Backups are always restorable. So Mike and I, we were actually chatting right before this. Mike said, this is absolutely great, because he looked at our product as well. Mike, you want to tell them what you told me?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, like, this is such a cool feature of N2WS. When we're talking about backups that have retention requirements that are measured in years and in some cases decades, with N2WS, you can restore those backups whether you continue to be an N2WS customer or not. So there's no lock-in there. N2WS will give you the ability to do those restores in the future when something changes and somebody else comes into the company and doesn't like N2WS's colors or something. But those backups, if they're retained because they need to be able to be restored at some point. And with N2WS, you can do that regardless of what your future, what changes in the future from a software perspective. I think that's really cool. It shows what type of company N2WS is, to me anyway, in terms of caring about the usability of your data more than they do themselves.
That's very nice. And somebody else in our marketing department said it right just the other day. I had an interesting call with a customer. We earn the customer's trust every single day, because N2WS Backup and Recovery is a subscription. It's a subscription model. The software gets installed in your account. And if at any point in time you decide, I don't want to use them anymore, that's okay. You can immediately cancel that subscription. And the data doesn't become locked or anything. It's yours. It runs in your environment. And you can either use our console in recovery-only mode, or if you really want to, you can even do this in the EC2 console itself. You can recover your data. So you're never locked in. All right, which brings us to the next slide. Let's see this in action, a live demo. This is always interesting because talk is cheap. What's important is, does it actually work? And what does it look like? So I'm going to walk you through how all of this, what we discussed, will actually work in your environment. Okay, so deploying this, super simple. AWS Marketplace, just simply choose which region you'd like to deploy it in, and then hit the continue button. Something that's very important is the solution is super lean. It actually only requires a T3 medium instance to work. And that's what translates into $14, $15 a month for EC2 runtime costs. Once the system is up and running, you communicate with it through a web portal, big surprise, and this is what it looks like. So right now I'm logged in as a root admin user, which means I get to see and do everything, which is great news for me. But of course, in a production environment, you would want to limit this. So we also have identity service provider support, multi-factor authentication support, and you can even put up virtual fences around the different data points that you're creating. So if I wanted to, if I have a database admin who's going to perform some development work on weekends, I can give him access to only his resources and nothing else. And all of these cool buttons that you're seeing here, you can also limit which one of those buttons they can actually use and what they can do with it. Anyway, what you're always going to see is what happened in the last 24 hours. As far as backups, disaster recovery, archiving, we're going to talk about that. And more information as far as, well, how much data are we actually protecting for you? That's down here, that cost explorer. That's that non-sticker shock guarantee. So we're keeping track of how many backups we're producing and how much that's going to cost you. You can even get detailed reports on how much does each of those backup policy going to cost me. So there's a breakdown behind that as well. We even have the ability to save you money by turning off resources when they're not needed. It's called that resource control feature. Turns out our parents were right when they said, turn off the light when you're not in the room. Well, it's the same thing with resources that aren't needed. So if you have certain resources, development instances that don't need to be up and running, we can manage all of that for you and can be completely automated as well. But let's talk about those immutable backups, right? So first off, how does that work? So as Mike already mentioned, so we do need an S3 bucket. So over here, we're in Amazon S3. So what I'm going to do is I'll create a bucket. The bucket name, keep in mind, those are global, which means you need to choose a bucket name that nobody else has chosen before. So wish me luck that nobody has chosen this one. And you can also choose the region in which you want to create this bucket. Then my ownership, that's my ACLs. I'm going to go with disabled here, but you can also choose your own. Block all public access. I never touch this because obviously I don't want any public access on my backup folders, my backup buckets. The bucket versioning, that needs to be turned on. So you need to enable that for the object lock to work. Now you can also apply tags. So if you want to categorize this, all these are my backups, those are my archives, that sort of thing, that makes a lot of sense as well. Of course, the content of these buckets is going to be encrypted as well. So you can choose, you want to use a KMS key or you want to use the S3 managed key. And then down here under advanced settings, you want to open that up. An object lock, there you go. That's default is disabled, so you want to enable this. Then there's a little disclaimer which shows exactly what Mike was telling you about. So whatever you're going to protect, that's going to be protected. So are you sure that you want to turn this on? So I'm going to say, yes, I read all of this and I'm fully aware of what object lock means. So then I'm going to create that bucket. And then you can either go to the bucket details right here, or you can choose that bucket right here out of your list. So I'm going to make it really easy on myself. So I'm going to click on bucket details. And that shows me that bucket that we just created. Go to properties. And then if you scroll down, so you can see the versioning is turned on, just keep scrolling all the way to the bottom. And then here, that's where we have the object lock. So as you can see, object lock is turned on, but the retention currently is disabled. So let's go over here to edit. And then we're going to turn this on. And then these are the two features, the two different modes that Mike was talking about. So there's governance and there's compliance. So governance, well, that is essentially immutability, which means cannot be changed over time. But there are times when you might want the ability to make some changes. So let's say a media production company needs to store video footage for a certain period of time to comply with contractual obligations and potential future use. And then they enable governance mode on their S3 bucket with a retention period of 1 year. However, let's say during the production process, there are some errors or issues with specific video files, and then the editing team needs the ability to make corrections or delete and replace those files. So with governance mode, the editing team can then make necessary modifications or deletions to the files before the 1 year retention period expires. That gives you a lot of flexibility as well. And then down here, this is where you choose, well, what's the retention period? And this can be in days all the way up to years. There are some customers that we deal with. Think of higher learning. Doesn't make any difference when you graduated. They need to be able to produce your records. Or think architectural offices. So whatever they produce, they need to retain the blueprint for the lifetime of whatever structure they created. Think in Europe. I mean, bridges, that could be 500 years. So this is where you can choose, well, what's the definition? What's the retention period where nobody should be able to make any changes to this? So in my case, I'm going to take 180 days. That's half a year. But you choose whatever is best for you and just simply save the changes. Now you have an immutable bucket. That's how easy it is to set this up. Now, if we go back into N2WS backup and recovery, this is when you choose to allow us to utilize that bucket. And the way that works is over here under storage repositories. That's where you can tell us which S3 buckets are we allowed to use. And this doesn't have to be just one particular account. As you can see, I can even use different buckets and different regions in different accounts. So I have a bunch of them. So when you define one of these S3 buckets, you can give it a friendly name, so this can be any name that you choose. Leave a description if you feel like it, and tell us which account we're looking through. And at that point, all you have to do is just simply choose the bucket. And so this is the one that we just created. And then there's one tick box. That's the important one. So if you used our product before, you probably haven't seen this before. So version 4.1.1 then supports immutable backups. And this tick box then makes it so that we honor those immutability factors, that S3 object log. So the only thing you need to do, just simply tick box this, immutable backups, and hit save. That's really all that's needed in order to define which S3 buckets are we allowed to use. Okay, so what does that look like then? So now that I have defined my buckets and preferably defined my immutable buckets, so what does it look like when we create these backup policies? Well, it's very simple. So as you can see, I have a bunch of backup policies already in place. So let's browse into one of them. Well, this is where you choose the schedule. How often would you like to perform backups? This can be as often as you want. And as I mentioned, this can also be as flexible and granular as you want it to be. You can create new ones over here, or if you already have some created, you just simply tick box which ones you want to use. Okay, I want to perform backups at midnight and at 6 o'clock and probably monthly and maybe quarterly. Totally up to you. You just simply choose these schedules that you want to apply. Backup targets, that's where you choose what you want to back up. There's two ways of selecting resources. One is completely automatic through tagging. So if you already have tags on your application set, on your data set, on your application stacks, we can read those and then sort the resources into the appropriate policies. Or, well, it's a graphical user interface. So that's why we have that button right here. So if I click on that, I can choose which services I want to back up. And this is mix and match. So you can choose instances and RDS databases, absolutely whatever you'd like. If you choose an EC2 instance, that'll automatically include the volumes. Of course, I also have the option to deselect certain volumes on an instance, but if you want to make it easy on yourself, just simply choose instances. So you can back up EC2 instances, volumes, RDS databases, all the different flavors there are, Aurora clusters. This also includes Aurora serverless, Redshift clusters, DynamoDB, Elastic file system, all the different flavors, FSX, Windows, Lustre, and even FSX on tap. And we also have the ability to sync S3 buckets. It makes absolutely no difference which one you're choosing because it all works the same way. So when you select this, you can browse through the different regions that you have access to based on the policy. And at that point, it's just a graphical user interface. You just point and click on Add Selected. That's really all there is to it. From that point on, we'll start creating these backups according to your schedules in the same region where the data is currently residing. It's pretty good, but we did talk about, well, how do we make this even more secure? So you do have the ability to create cross-account and cross-region disaster recovery backups. So that means when you turn this on, which I already have, you can then choose which other regions you want to make this snapshot, this backup available. So my data lives in North Virginia, so I'm also going to make it available in Ohio because, well, nothing bad ever happens in Ohio. But if you want to choose cross-account disaster recovery backups, you have that option as well. And in that secondary account that I'm choosing here, I also have the ability to choose different regions here as well. This is interesting as well because we did talk about ransomware protection. We also have another feature called Secure DR. Let me show you that real quick before we talk about the S3 immutable backups. So Secure DR, what this means is you define an AWS account where we're going to make these backups available. And Secure DR account then also allows you to select prohibited permissions, objectionable permissions that you don't want anybody to have in that account. So for show and tell, I usually do delete snapshot. I don't want anybody being able to delete my snapshots. And this works for all of the different services. So when you select this, what we're going to do is we're going to continuously monitor if anybody has these objectionable prohibited permissions in that account. And it's not just the role of the IAM user that we're using. No, it's all the roles and all the users in that account. So even if you have a seldomly used user or a seldomly used role in that account, and a hacker is trying to sneak in permissions on one of those accounts, well, it's not going to happen because we are literally monitoring for this. So Secure DR, really important feature as well, because it will protect you continuously, even on accounts that we are not using. And you can make these even very granular, fine-grained. So if you wouldn't want us to be able to delete anything, you can do that as well. I actually have some customers who do this. So that's when you have that super secure vault that even we can't get into. But let's talk about the archiving and the immutable backups. So if we go back into that backup policy, we did talk about DR. So let's talk about lifecycle management. So when I click on that, this is where you choose how many native snapshots would you like us to keep. This is that near zero RTO. Get the data back super quick. But not all data needs to be available in those costly snapshots. So you want to keep that number pretty low. So I'm performing daily backups. I'm super conservative. So probably 7 days, because as I said, generally you want to go back to the last backup or the backup from last Friday. So let's keep a limited number of snapshots. And then past that point, I can say, okay, well, let's keep the data in S3 for a longer amount of time. And you can do this by time. You can also do this by generations or combination. However, human brains usually work with time. People usually tell me, I want to keep the data for 7 years. Nobody has ever said, I want to keep the data for 384 generations. So you choose for how long would you like to keep the data in S3. And if you want to keep the data for a very long time, well, we might want to keep it in Glacier. We can do this. And generally, that's when you want to keep the data for a long amount of time. We're talking months and years and years and years. Remember that S3 bucket that we created, that immutable 3 bucket? That's where you choose this. So that target repository, that's when we created a storage repository, that's where that becomes available then. And you can just simply choose that here. And these steps, so this is step number 1. And this, the archiving into Glacier, that's step number 2. And you can tell us which storage tier would you like us to use for this. So the bucket itself is immutable, and for how long do you want to keep that data there? Well, so standard S3, that's going to cut your storage cost right in half. Standard S3 is half the cost of EBS snapshots. Infrequent access, you think I'm probably not going to touch that data, I just need to keep it in case. Well, that's a good choice because, well, that's a 75% savings. And Glacier, well, if you do the math, that's about a 92, 93% savings. And Deep Archive Glacier, that's so dirt cheap, you might as well keep it forever. I mean, Deep Archive Glacier, that's 99 cents per terabyte per month. So as I said, you might as well keep the data forever. That effectively at that point, you're just paying 2% of what you normally would pay for a snapshot. And there is another storage tier as well, which is called Glacier Instant Retrieval. So that is the best of both worlds. So essentially, you're storing the data in Glacier with none of the disadvantages. You can immediately get to that data. And again, if you do the math, that's about a 90% savings. I mean, 90% savings on your storage costs, and you can put this into an immutable bucket for any amount of time you want. So that's really where you can save money. And if you like the idea of saving money, well, we can do the same thing also for RDS as well. So that's another button here. So if you choose RDS databases, we can archive that into S3 buckets as well. Retrieving the data, super easy. There's absolutely no difference to storing the data in regular snapshots. So when you go to Backup Monitor, that's your single pane of glass. All of the backups are going to be visible here. Doesn't make any difference which accounts you stored it in, which region, it's all here. And you can sort this is how I do it, in chronological order. But of course, if you'd like to sort it by users, by accounts, you can do that as well. You can even search through this. So by accounts, users, policies, and even the resources themselves. So if you're looking for something specific, any metadata on that, that's searchable. So if I have some EC2 instances with Active Directory, sure, I can show that. So then you just simply choose, so in my case, that was that Windows, and you click on Recover. And then you can recover that data into any region, into any account. If I have disaster recovery backup, I can even get to the data in that disaster recovery account, in that disaster recovery region. And if you want to recover the data from S3, nothing changes. It's essentially just restore from either from a snapshot or from your S3. And down here, this is where you choose the different resources. There's just 2 servers here, but this scales to any number of resources. So I have some customers who back up 4,000, 6,000, 7,000 different resources. You choose a resource, and then you have 3 more options. You can recover the entire resource. You can recover certain volumes, or you can even drill into this. And that brings up a file manager, and you can pick and choose certain files out of that backup. This even has the ability to do multi-generational file and folder level recovery. That's a really fancy way of saying we can look through a whole bunch of backups all at once. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm missing a file or a folder, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, when was the last time you had that file or that folder? And I also know what they're going to answer. They're going to say, I don't know. Well, that's terrible because now I need to browse through all of my backups to see when was the last time you had that. So what we can do is we can literally open a whole bunch of different backups, the last week, the last 10 weeks if you want to, and then look through them. So in my case here, I opened the last 4 days. Here's your search capability. So then that's what I'm going to use to search for that file or that folder to actually get to what I want to recover. Remember earlier when I mentioned that we also back up the metadata that goes along with it. So all of this information here, VPC settings, subnet settings, routing tables, IP settings, all of that is stored. And we can even clone all of this information into other regions and even into other accounts. So this makes sure that not only are we backing up the resource, but we're also backing up all the network configurations that go along with it. if you're really interested in that feature, look at the different accounts that you have. So here, for example, I have my AWS account, clone VPC entities. That's the entire inventory of all of the VPC settings, the transit gateways, everything that I stored in my environment. And I can pick and choose if I wanted to. And it's not just the most recent. So if somebody says, hey, that file server, I want this to be exactly in the same state it was in on November 18th, 2020, I can do you one better. Not only can I bring back the entire content of that resource, but I can also bring back the network configuration from that day. And I can clone this into another region. So if you want to spin up your entire environment in a different region into a different account, sure, not a problem. Not only the resource, but also the network configuration. This is going to do that. That entire process takes about 30 seconds. And if you feel so inclined, you can even take your network configuration and export it as a CloudFormation template. So that's interesting, because even if you didn't start with infrastructure as code, now we're going to turn your infrastructure into code. And all of this, of course, you can report on as well. So that really, all around, to bring it full circle, gives you that full protection. So you have your backups, very fast snapshots. I can bring them back within seconds. I can bring them back in another region, in another account, within seconds. And then, of course, I also have that immutability feature. I can store the data in immutable buckets. And not only are they more secure at that point, because, well, I have that immutability feature, but even then I can save a lot of money by storing them in S3. So all around, a really good thing. Now this is where I'm going to try not to stop my screen sharing again. Now you're probably wondering, this all sounds absolutely fantastic and great. Everything I just showed you, you can also try out for yourself in a 30-day free trial. Just simply sign up at n2ws.com/trial, and you can spin up the product and all of those features, everything I just showed you, you can literally try this out for free in our trial. We also now open up the floor to any questions you might have.
Yeah, so Sebastian, just really quick before we did that, so one question came up about any downsides, and so I wanted to go through a couple of things. That was an awesome demo, by the way. So I think, you did a good job of showing how this is set up. So some key things are, number one, I think everyone should make sure you understand your retention requirements and have a plan before you start setting this up. I think as a best practice, I would suggest using governance mode unless you have a specific requirement for compliance mode. So a potential downside in compliance mode, objects cannot be deleted by anyone, and that includes AWS. So if somebody, and trust me, this has happened, if you write data in compliance mode with a lock of 10 years, you're storing that data for 10 years. You're going to delete the AWS account. It's one or the other. Like there's no way to delete that data. So like I said, just think through what you need to do and what your retention requirements are before you start locking things. And then keep in mind the object lock retention is that we're setting that at the bucket level, which is separate from the N2WS backup retention. So in many cases, or in most cases, it makes sense for the lock to be shorter than the backup retention in N2WS. So you can let the software manage that. And then, the last thing is keep in mind, Sebastian went through the storage classes in S3. Those have different minimum storage durations. So that can also be a factor that you want to include when you're thinking through your plan. So the deep archive has a minimum of retention of 180 days. So it wouldn't make sense to use that if you didn't have a retention requirement of at least 180 days and things like that. So hopefully that answers the question. Just want to touch on that.
I saw that. I saw one of the questions. Is there any downside to turning on immutable backups? Yeah, the downside is you want to make sure you want to keep them because they're going to be there. Then another question that's there, what about SQL and Oracle backups? Not a problem. So if doesn't make any difference if it's running on Linux, if it's running on Windows. So all of that, you can perform backups of those. And we even have the ability to perform application consistent backups for SQL, for Oracle, gosh, Cassandra, MySQL, Postgres, you name it. Whatever you're running, we can back it up. That's the beauty of AWS, right? You have your system running in an EC2 server, and it makes absolutely no difference what operating system runs there and what database runs on there. We're going to be able to back that up in an application consistent manner. So there is also a question about the permissions needed. That's interesting as well, because backup solutions, it's a necessary evil. Nobody likes performing backups. It's like car insurance. Nobody likes paying car insurance, but it's great when you get into trouble if you have an accident. It's the same thing with your backups. But the nice thing about N2WS backup and recovery is we're not going to say, hey, I'm a backup solution. Give me admin permissions. I want everything. Not at all. It's super granular. Every single function that we can perform, you have the ability to turn that on and off. So if you're saying, I don't think I'm ever going to perform backups of RDS, that's great. We don't need access to RDS. So you are in very granular, fine-grained control of which permissions you want to allow us. And this isn't something you have to trial and error figure out. So all of the permissions that we need, they're already predefined. We give them to you as a JSON file, and you can review them. So a lot of times when I work with large corporations, that's what they do. They review the permissions and then pick and choose which ones they want to give us. So that's something you would find out through that trial as well, because it's literally going to provide you with everything. Oh, there's another one as well. Can this solution protect on-prem infrastructure? So we are cloud native. We were born in the cloud, for the cloud, in the cloud. So we have nothing to do with on-prem. Even though it's kind of a caveat to this, if you want to consider AWS Outpost as on-prem, yeah, then the answer would be sure. If you have AWS Outpost, we are on-prem as well. But we are in the AWS cloud, for the cloud. Once your data is in the AWS cloud, that's when we kick in. And that's really best of breed within the cloud environment. Gosh, and I managed to actually go 1 minute over. So I guess none of these questions that we haven't been able to go through are going to go unanswered. So we extract all of those, and we're definitely going to be in contact with you on all of those, so you'll definitely get your answer. I apologize, I went a little bit over, but as I said, a call to action, take a look at our 30-day free trial. That will answer a whole bunch of questions for you as well. And you can see that everything I just showed you works for you in your environment as well. Mike, did you have fun?
I did, yeah. I just wanted to quickly say thank you for the invite to participate, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us. And I enjoyed it. It definitely was fun. I enjoyed watching the demo. And,
it's always fun. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and you all have a great rest of your day.